along the jagged coastline of South Carolina, tucked between the marshlands where no official records could ever reach, a network of hidden coves operated for nearly 40 years without appearing on a single customs ledger. Between 1823 and 1861, over 3,000 souls passed through these unmarked landings, their arrivals never documented, their destinations never questioned. The federal government had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, but in the salt-heavy air of those secret shores, the law meant nothing. What makes this story different is not the crime itself, but the man who survived long enough to expose it and the brutal price his testimony demanded. His name appears in only one courthouse document, a testimony so disturbing that it was sealed for 73 years. The document describes a night in June 1861 when 23 people were taken to a mudflat at low tide, shackled, and left there as the water rose. 22 of them drowned. One survived. And what he revealed would unravel a conspiracy that had operated under the noses of an entire community for 4 decades. Before we continue with the story of how one man's survival shattered decades of silence, subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from, because this story could have happened closer to you than you think. What makes the testimony of Samuel Oakes unlike any other account from that era is not just what he revealed about the ships, the captains, or the merchants. It's what he revealed about the ordinary people who lived within walking distance of those coves and chose for 40 years to hear nothing, see nothing, and say nothing at all. People who attended church every Sunday, who celebrated Independence Day, who sent their children to school, and who knew exactly what was happening in the darkness beyond their town, yet never spoke a word. To understand how Blind Landing could operate for 40 years in complete secrecy, you must first understand the geography of coastal South Carolina in the 19th century. The South Carolina low country is not like other coastlines. It is not a simple boundary between land and sea, but rather a complex transition zone where the two elements merge into something else entirely. A world of salt marshes, tidal creeks, barrier islands, and shifting sandbars that changes with every tide, every storm, every season. The coastline stretches for nearly 200 miles, but if you were to measure every inlet, every creek, every meandering channel, the actual distance would be thousands of miles. For centuries, this landscape had been the domain of the indigenous peoples who knew its rhythms intimately. By the 1820s, it had become something else, a perfect hiding place for activities that could not bear scrutiny. The major ports, Charleston, Georgetown, Beaufort, were well-established centers of commerce by the early 19th century. These cities had wharves, warehouses, customs houses, and harbor masters. Ships arriving at these ports were inspected, their cargoes recorded, their captains questioned. The system was not perfect, corruption was common, and inspectors could be bribed, but it existed, and it created a paper trail. But between these official ports lay vast stretches of coastline that saw no customs officers, no federal inspectors, no military patrols. The marshes were considered worthless land, too wet for farming, too shallow for large ships, too disease-ridden for settlement. Only fishermen and hunters ventured into these areas, and they learned quickly that the marshes were treacherous. Channels that were navigable at high tide became impassable mudflats at low tide. Sandbars appeared and disappeared. Storms could alter the entire geography overnight. For anyone who didn't know these waters intimately, the low-country marshes were a maze with no exit. But for those who had grown up on these tides, who had learned from childhood to read the subtle signs of current and depth, the marshes were navigable, and they offered countless hidden approaches to the mainland. Blind Landing was located in one of the most isolated sections of this coastline, approximately 37 miles north of Charleston and 8 miles south of Georgetown. The nearest town was Ashfield, population 312 according to the 1830 census. Ashfield sat 4 miles inland, connected to the coast by a single rutted road that was barely passable in wet weather. The road wound through pine forests and cypress swamps before reaching the coast, and there were no settlements along its length, just empty woodland and the occasional abandoned rice field. The cove itself was crescent-shaped, perhaps 400 yards wide at its mouth, narrowing to less than 100 yards at its inland terminus. Ancient live oaks surrounded the cove, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hung like grey curtains. During the day, the cove looked picturesque, almost peaceful. The water was dark and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Herons waded in the shallows. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of marsh birds. But at night, the cove became something else. The darkness under the oak canopy was absolute. The sounds of the marsh, the splash of fish, the calls of night birds, the rustling of creatures in the undergrowth, created an atmosphere of primal unease. And when the tide went out, the mudflats emerged, vast expanses of slick, treacherous mud that seemed to swallow light itself. The channel that led to Blind Landing from the open ocean was the key to its secrecy. The channel was barely 6 feet deep at high tide, invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the local waters. It wound through the marsh in a serpentine path, doubling back on itself, splitting into false channels that led nowhere. A ship captain attempting to navigate it without local knowledge would almost certainly run aground. But for those who knew the route, who had memorized every turn, every landmark, every subtle shift in the color of the water that indicated depth, the channel was a hidden highway. The men who ran Blind Landing had grown up on these waters. They were sons of fishermen and coastal traders, men who had spent their childhoods learning to read tides and currents the way other children learn to read books. They knew that the channel was navigable only during a 3-hour window around high tide. They knew which phases of the moon produced the highest tides. They knew how to read the weather and predict when conditions would be favorable for a landing. And they knew that if they timed everything correctly, a ship could anchor 3 miles offshore, send smaller boats through the channel to Blind Landing, unload their cargo, and be gone before dawn, leaving no trace except footprints in the mud that the next tide would erase. The town of Ashfield was, by all appearances, an ordinary southern community in the antebellum era. It had been founded in 1798 by a group of settlers from the Virginia Piedmont who had purchased land grants in South Carolina. The town was laid out in a simple grid, a main street with a handful of shops and businesses, and residential streets radiating outward where families built their homes. By the 1820s, Ashfield had settled into a comfortable existence. It was not wealthy by Charleston standards. There were no grand mansions, no aristocratic families with European connections, but it was prosperous in a modest way. The surrounding land was suitable for cotton and some rice cultivation, and most families owned small farms. A few of the more ambitious planters had acquired larger holdings and had begun to see significant profits. The town had 2 churches, one Methodist, one Baptist, that competed politely for congregants. It had a general store run by a man named Hiram Burke, who sold everything from fabric to farm implements to patent medicines. It had a blacksmith named Otto Lang, a German immigrant who was known for his skill with both horseshoes and wagon repairs. It had a tavern called the Carolina House, operated by a widow named Mrs. Adelaide Crowe, where men gathered in the evenings to drink, play cards, and discuss politics. There was a schoolhouse where children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic from a stern New England-born teacher named Miss Abigail Porter. There was a doctor, Calvin Yates, who had studied medicine in Philadelphia and had returned to South Carolina to establish his practice. There was a lawyer, Howard Brennan, who handled property transactions and wills. On the surface, Ashfield looked like 100 other small southern towns. Its citizens attended church on Sundays, where they sang hymns and listened to sermons about Christian duty and moral rectitude. They celebrated the 4th of July with barbecues and speeches about liberty and the American experiment. They sent their sons to militia musters and took pride in their service. They married, had children, buried their dead, and went about the business of living. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, there was another Ashfield, an unspoken understanding that certain questions were not to be asked, certain observations were not to be shared, certain activities were not to be acknowledged. The arrangement had begun almost by accident. In 1823, a ship captain named Marcus Dane had approached a planter near Ashfield about purchasing laborers. Dane explained that he could provide workers at prices significantly below the market rate, but the transaction would have to be conducted discreetly. The planter, a man named William Cobb, understood immediately what Dane was offering. people who had been transported illegally from Africa in violation of the 1808 prohibition. Cobb had wrestled with the decision for perhaps an hour. He was not a particularly religious man, but he considered himself moral. He had never questioned the institution of slavery. It was the foundation of his livelihood, after all. But he had always told himself that he was not personally responsible for the Atlantic trade. He purchased his laborers through reputable dealers who assured him that they were domestic-born or had been imported legally before 1808. But Dane's offer was compelling. The price was less than half of what Cobb would pay through legitimate channels, and Dane assured him that the transaction could be conducted in complete secrecy. No paperwork, no witnesses, no risk of prosecution. Cobb agreed, and in doing so, he made a choice that would define Ashfield for the next 4 decades. The first landing at Blind Landing took place on a moonless night in September 1823. Dane's ship anchored offshore, and smaller boats brought 17 people through the channel to the cove. Cobb was waiting with 2 wagons. The transaction took less than an hour. Money changed hands. The people were loaded into the wagons, hidden beneath false floors covered with sacks of rice. And by dawn, Cobb's new workers were on his plantation, and Dane's ship was gone. It had been remarkably easy, and that ease was seductive. Within a year, Dane had approached other planters in the area. Some refused, either out of moral objection or fear of prosecution. But enough agreed that Blind Landing became a regular operation. Dane was careful. He never brought more than 20 or 30 people at a time, and he spaced the landings months apart. He varied the timing, sometimes arriving in spring, sometimes in fall. He used different ships, different crews. He never followed a predictable pattern. The planters who purchased from Dane formed an informal network. They never discussed the arrangement openly, even among themselves. But they understood that their mutual interest required mutual silence. If one of them were caught, if federal authorities began investigating, it would endanger them all. And so a culture of silence took root in Ashfield. The planters said nothing. Their overseers, who certainly knew where the new workers had come from, said nothing. And gradually the silence spread to everyone else in town. The blacksmith, Otto Lang, knew because he shod the horses for the wagons that made the midnight runs to the coast. The tavern keeper, Mrs. Crow, knew because she served drinks to the ship captains and crew members who came through town before and after landings. The merchant, Hiram Burke, knew because he sold provisions, rope, canvas, chains, to men who paid in cash and asked no questions. The doctor, Calvin Yates, knew because he was occasionally called to treat injuries or illness among the newly arrived, and he recognized immediately that these people had just come off a ship. Each of them made a choice, conscious or otherwise, to say nothing, and each of them benefited directly or indirectly from the operation. Lang's business prospered. Mrs. Crow's Tavern became the most profitable establishment in town. Burke expanded his store. Yates treated more patients and earned more fees. The silence was not enforced through threats or violence, at least not in the beginning. It was maintained through something more subtle, a collective understanding that prosperity depended on discretion and that breaking the silence would harm everyone. The planters who purchased through Blind Landing had lower labor costs and higher profits. The businesses that served those planters thrived. Even the townspeople who were not directly involved benefited from the general economic growth. By the 1830s, Blind Landing had become an institution. The landings happened 3 or 4 times a year, regular enough to be relied upon, but infrequent enough to avoid detection. The operation had expanded beyond Marcus Dane. Other ship captains had learned of the arrangement and begun using Blind Landing themselves. And the network of complicit planters had grown to include men from 3 counties. The people of Ashfield told themselves that they were not personally responsible. They were not the ones bringing ships from Africa. They were not the ones purchasing the people who came off those ships. They were simply going about their lives, running their businesses, supporting their families. If they happened to profit in small ways from activities they didn't directly participate in, well, that was not the same as being guilty. It was a comfortable lie, and they clung to it for 40 years. Samuel's life before his capture exists in his memory as fragments, pieces of a shattered mirror that he could never quite reassemble. He was born in a village whose name he would spend decades trying to recall. In his testimony before Congress in 1898, he said only, "I remember the sound of the name, the way it felt in my mouth, but the word itself is gone. It is as if that part of my mind was cut away." What he did remember: the village was several days' walk from the coast, situated near a river whose waters ran clear over smooth stones. The houses were built of mud brick and thatch. His father had been a craftsman who worked with iron, forging tools and ornaments. His mother had died when he was young. He could not remember how, and he had been raised by his father and his father's younger brother. The village was prosperous, or at least Samuel remembered it that way. They grew yams, cassava, and millet. They kept goats and chickens. Trade caravans passed through occasionally, and Samuel's father would trade iron goods for salt, cloth, and other necessities. Life followed rhythms that had existed for generations: the planting season, the harvest season, the dry season, the rains. Samuel had learned his father's trade. By the time he was 16 or 17, he had no precise way of measuring his age. He could work the bellows, heat iron to the correct temperature, and shape it into blades and tools. He had expected to spend his life in the village, to marry, to have children, to pass the trade to his own sons. He remembered the night of the raid with terrible clarity. It came without warning. One moment he was sleeping in his father's house, and the next he was jolted awake by screams and the sound of musket fire. The village was on fire. Men were running through the streets with torches and weapons, not soldiers in uniform but raiders, some of them recognizable as men from villages Samuel had traded with. The raid had been organized. Samuel would understand this only later, but at the moment he understood nothing except terror. The raiders moved with purpose, kicking in doors, dragging people out of their homes. Those who resisted were struck down. Those who ran were chased and tackled. Within minutes, the entire village was in chaos. Samuel's father tried to fight. He grabbed an iron rod, one of his own creations, and swung it at the raiders who burst through their door. He struck one man across the face, breaking his jaw. But there were too many of them. They overwhelmed him, beating him with clubs until he stopped moving. Samuel tried to reach his father, but hands seized him from behind. He was thrown to the ground, and before he could rise, his wrists were bound with rope. He was dragged into the street where dozens of others from the village, mostly young men and women but also some children, were being assembled. The raiders separated the captives into groups. Samuel found himself in a line with about 40 others, all bound at the wrists. They were forced to begin walking immediately, driven forward by men with whips and muskets. Samuel looked back once and saw his village burning, smoke rising into the night sky. They walked for 7 days. Samuel lost track of distance and direction. They moved through forests, across rivers, through territory Samuel had never seen before. They were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive. At night, they were forced to sleep on the ground, still bound. Those who became too weak to walk were left behind. On the 3rd day, Samuel's uncle, who had been captured along with him, stumbled and fell. He was older, perhaps 50, and the march was too much for him. The raiders shouted at him to get up. When he couldn't, they beat him. When he still couldn't rise, they cut him loose from the line and walked away, leaving him there on the side of the path. Samuel tried to stop, tried to go back, but the line kept moving. He called out to his uncle, but there was no response. That was the last time he saw any member of his family. On the 7th day, they reached the coast. Samuel had never seen the ocean before. The sight of it, that vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon, filled him with a dread he could not name. They were taken to a fortified compound near the shore, a place built of stone and timber with high walls and guards at every entrance. This was a barracoon, a holding facility where captured Africans were kept until ships arrived to transport them. The barracoon was a vision of hell. It was designed to hold perhaps 100 people. When Samuel arrived, there were at least 300 crammed inside. The structure was divided into large pens, each one holding 50 or 60 people. The floor was dirt. There was no furniture, no bedding, nothing but bare ground and the press of bodies. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of sweat, excrement, and sickness. Samuel was thrown into one of the pens. The space was so crowded that there was barely room to sit. At night, everyone lay down where they stood, bodies pressed against each other. During the day they stood or crouched, waiting. Food came once a day. A thin gruel made of millet or cassava, distributed in wooden bowls that were shared among groups. Water came twice a day, carried in buckets and ladled out. The portions were small, calculated to keep people alive, but not healthy. The barracoon was run by a mixture of African and European traders. Samuel would later learn that this was typical. The Atlantic slave trade was not a crime committed by one group against another, but a complex network of complicity involving people from multiple continents. African raiders captured people from inland villages. African and European merchants purchased them at the coast. European and American ship captains transported them across the ocean, and American and Caribbean planters purchased them at the other end. Everyone in the chain profited. Everyone in the chain told themselves they were not responsible for what came before or after their own transaction. Samuel spent 6 weeks in the barracoon, though he had no way of marking time. Days blurred together into a continuous nightmare. People around him sickened and died. Bodies were removed each morning, dragged out of the pens and taken somewhere beyond the walls. No one spoke of what happened to them. Samuel learned quickly that the only way to survive was to shut down. He stopped thinking about his village, his father, his old life. He stopped thinking about the future. He existed only in the moment, focusing on nothing beyond the next bowl of food, the next ladle of water, the next night survived. Then, one morning, the gates of the barracoon opened and guards began shouting orders. Chains were brought out, long chains with iron collars attached at intervals. The captives were organized into coffles, groups of 15 or 20 people, all chained together at the neck. Samuel found himself chained between a young woman who wept continuously and an older man who stared ahead with blank, dead eyes. They were marched out of the barracoon and down to the shore, where boats waited. Beyond the boats, perhaps half a mile offshore, a ship lay at anchor. The ship was not large by commercial standards. Samuel would later learn it was a Baltimore clipper, a type of fast schooner that had become popular in the illegal trade because of its speed. But to Samuel, who had never seen a seagoing vessel before, it looked enormous. 3 masts rose from its deck, and the hull sat low in the water. The boats made multiple trips, ferrying people from shore to ship. Samuel's group was among the last to be loaded. When his turn came, he was unchained from the coffle and forced into one of the boats. The boat rocked sickeningly as it moved through the surf, and Samuel, who had never been on water before, felt his stomach rebel. When they reached the ship, he was forced to climb a rope ladder up the side. His hands, weakened by weeks of malnourishment, could barely grip the rungs. When he reached the deck, he was immediately seized by crew members and forced toward a hatch that led below. The hold of the ship was divided into 2 levels. The lower level, where Samuel would spend most of the voyage, had a ceiling height of perhaps 4 feet. People were packed onto wooden shelves in rows, lying on their sides because there was not enough room to sit up. Samuel was pushed into a space between 2 other men, a gap so narrow that his shoulders touched theirs on both sides. The hatch was closed, the darkness was absolute. And slowly, as more and more people were forced into the hold, the air became thick and foul. Samuel later estimated that there were over 300 people in the hold, though he never counted them himself. The number came from the ship's manifest, a document that would eventually be seized by British naval officers in 1867 and placed into archives. The manifest listed the ship as the Mariposa, registered in Baltimore, captained by a man named Leonard Voss. The manifest declared the ship's cargo as palm oil and ivory. In reality, there was no palm oil and no ivory, only people. A jornada de Samuel, parte 3, a travesía. The voyage across the Atlantic, what historians would later call the Middle Passage, took 43 days. Samuel would not learn this number until years afterward. During the voyage itself, he had no sense of time. There was no day or night in the hold, only a continuous darkness, broken occasionally when the hatches were opened and light flooded in. He remembered very little of the crossing. His mind, unable to process the horror of the conditions, simply shut down. He entered a state that was not quite consciousness and not quite unconsciousness. a gray limbo where time ceased to have meaning. The conditions in the hold were beyond description. The ceiling was so low that sitting up was impossible. People lay on their sides, packed so tightly that movement was impossible. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, vomit, excrement, and death. Disease spread rapidly through the hold. Dysentery, fever, infections. People died every day, their bodies remaining in place until the crew opened the hatches and removed them. Food came once a day when weather permitted. The hatches would open, and buckets would be lowered containing a mixture of rice or beans and water, cooked into a tasteless mash. People ate with their hands, scooping the food from communal buckets. There was never enough. Water came twice a day, ladled out in small portions that left everyone constantly thirsty. The crew sometimes brought people up onto the deck in small groups, forcing them to move around to prevent their muscles from atrophying completely. These moments on deck were the only time Samuel saw daylight during the crossing. He would stand on the rolling deck, his legs barely able to support him, and stare at the endless ocean surrounding the ship. The vastness of it filled him with despair. They were utterly alone, surrounded by water in every direction, with no hope of escape or rescue. The worst moments came during storms. The ship would pitch violently, and in the hold, people would be thrown against each other and against the wooden walls. Water would pour through the seams in the deck above, soaking everyone below. The sounds were terrifying. The creaking of the ship's timbers, the howling of wind, the thunder of waves crashing against the hull. Samuel was certain during those storms that the ship would sink and they would all drown, trapped in the darkness of the hold. But the ship did not sink. It continued forward, day after day, week after week, crossing the Atlantic. Samuel later testified that he remembered the exact moment when he decided he was already dead. It was during the third or fourth week, he wasn't sure which. The man lying next to him had died during the night, and his body had not yet been removed. Samuel was lying pressed against a corpse, and he understood with sudden clarity that there was no meaningful difference between them. He was dead in every way that mattered. His body was still functioning, but the person he had been, the young man who had worked with his father, who had lived in a village with a name he could no longer remember, was gone. The realization was oddly comforting. If he was already dead, then there was nothing more to fear. He would carry that feeling with him for the rest of his life, a fundamental disconnect between his body and his sense of self. Even decades later, living in Philadelphia with a family and a trade, part of Samuel Oakes believed he had died in that ship's hold in 1859, and that everything afterward was an epilogue. The Mariposa approached the South Carolina coast on a moonless night in September 1859. Captain Leonard Voss had made this run 8 times before, and he knew the protocols precisely. The ship never approached during daylight. It never came close to Charleston or Georgetown, where patrol boats might spot it. Instead, it anchored 3 miles offshore in waters deep enough for the ship, but shallow enough to be out of normal shipping lanes. Of the 317 people who had been loaded onto the ship in Africa, 206 remained alive when it reached the Carolina coast. The bodies of the others had been thrown overboard during the crossing, committed to the ocean without ceremony or record. The survivors were brought up from the hold in groups. Samuel remembered emerging onto the deck and breathing fresh air for the first time in over a month. The sensation was overwhelming. The cool night breeze, the smell of land, the sight of stars overhead. His legs would barely hold him. He had to be supported by crew members as he was moved toward the ship's rail. Small boats waited below, swift, narrow launches designed for shallow water. Samuel and 19 others were loaded into the third boat. They sat on the bottom of the boat, packed together as crew members began rowing toward shore. The journey to Blind Landing took perhaps an hour. Samuel could see nothing in the darkness except the faint outline of trees against the sky. He could hear the sound of oars cutting through water, the cry of night birds, the splash of fish. The air was heavy with humidity and the smell of salt marsh, mud, rotting vegetation, and brine. When the boat finally scraped onto the mud flat at Blind Landing, Samuel was pulled out and forced to wade through knee-deep water to reach solid ground. His legs, weakened by 6 weeks of immobility, collapsed under him. He fell face first into the mud. Hands grabbed him and hauled him upright, dragging him toward the trees. There were men waiting on shore with lanterns. Samuel caught only brief glimpses of them. White men in rough clothing, speaking English in low voices. They moved with practiced efficiency, directing the new arrivals into wooden pens that had been constructed just beyond the tree line. The pens were crude structures, posts driven into the ground with horizontal boards nailed between them, creating enclosures about 15 feet square. Each pen had a single gate secured with a chain and padlock. There was no roof, just open sky above. The floor was bare earth. Samuel was pushed into one of the pens with 19 others. The gate was locked behind them, and then the men with lanterns walked away, leaving them in darkness. For a long time, no one spoke. They simply stood or sat in the pen, too exhausted and disoriented to do anything else. Some wept quietly. Others stared into space with the same blank expression Samuel had seen in the barracoon and on the ship. They were alive, but they were not whole. Dawn came slowly. As light filtered through the oak trees, Samuel got his first clear look at where they were. The pen sat in a small clearing surrounded by massive live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Beyond the trees, he could see water, a dark, still cove that reflected the morning sky. The mudflats where they had landed the night before were visible now at low tide. Vast stretches of slick gray mud that looked like they could swallow a person whole. Food came at midday. Buckets of water and cornmeal brought by a man who unlocked the gate just long enough to set them inside, then locked it again without speaking. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, and he moved quickly, as if reluctant to be seen. That pattern continued for 3 days. Twice a day the silent man brought food and water. The rest of the time, they were left alone in the pen. At night, Samuel could hear wagons arriving. The creak of wheels, the sound of horses, voices conducting business in tones too low to make out words. He could hear other pens being opened, people being removed. He understood that transactions were happening, that they were being sold. On the 4th day, it was Samuel's turn. The gate opened at dawn, and a different man appeared, this one wearing better clothing, a long coat and polished boots. He was accompanied by 2 others who appeared to be overseers or hired workers. The well-dressed man walked into the pen and began examining the people inside, checking teeth, feeling arms and shoulders, assessing them like livestock. He selected 7, including Samuel. The 7 were taken out of the pen and loaded into a wagon. The wagon had a false bottom, a wooden platform that created a hidden space underneath. Samuel and the others were made to lie flat in this space, and then the platform was closed over them. He heard sacks being loaded on top, rice from the smell and weight of them. The journey in the hidden compartment was suffocating. The space was barely 18 inches high, not enough to even turn over. The weight of the rice sacks pressed down on the wooden platform above them, making it feel like the ceiling might collapse at any moment. The air was stifling, and every bump in the road sent pain shooting through Samuel's back and shoulders. The journey lasted hours. Samuel later estimated 4 or 5, though it was impossible to judge time in that darkness. When the wagon finally stopped and the platform was lifted, Samuel was pulled out into blinding sunlight. He found himself on a plantation that he would later know as the Hartwell Estate, owned by a man named Duncan Hartwell. An overseer, a lean, hard-faced man named Virgil Tench, was waiting. Tench looked the 7 new arrivals over with an expression that mixed appraisal with contempt. Then he gestured toward a row of crude cabins at the edge of a field and said in English that Samuel did not yet understand, "That's where you'll sleep. You start work at dawn tomorrow. Anyone who doesn't work doesn't eat. Anyone who runs gets the lash. Any questions?" No one responded. Samuel didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. He had arrived at what would be his home for the next 2 years. The Hartwell estate was not one of the grand plantations of the South Carolina Low Country. It was a mid-sized operation of approximately 800 acres, with perhaps half of that under cultivation. The primary crop was rice, grown in fields that had been carved out of the swampland and could be flooded with water from the nearby river. Rice cultivation in the Low Country was brutal work. The fields had to be prepared, flooded, drained, and flooded again at precise times. Workers stood in water up to their knees for hours at a time, planting, weeding, and harvesting. The water was breeding ground for mosquitoes and diseases, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery were endemic. The heat and humidity were oppressive, especially in summer when temperatures regularly exceeded 95 degrees. Duncan Hartwell owned 42 enslaved people when Samuel arrived. Most had been born on the plantation or on neighboring estates and had worked the rice fields their entire lives. They had developed a tight-knit community with its own hierarchies, relationships, and survival strategies. Samuel and the 6 others who had arrived with him from Blind Landing were outsiders, and they were viewed with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The language barrier was the first challenge. Samuel spoke none of English and had limited ability to communicate even with other Africans on the plantation, as they often came from different regions and spoke different languages. He learned primarily through observation and repetition, picking up words and phrases gradually over months. The work routine was established by Virgil Tench, the overseer, and it varied little from day to day. Workers rose before dawn and assembled in the main yard. Tench would assign tasks for the day, some to the rice fields, others to maintenance work, repairs, or other plantation duties. Work continued until sunset, with a brief break at midday for a meal of cornbread and whatever vegetables were available. Samuel was assigned to the rice fields. The work was backbreaking. He stood in the flooded fields, bent over, planting rice shoots in neat rows. The water was warm and murky, and his feet sank into the mud with every step. By the end of the first day, his back screamed with pain, and his hands were covered in cuts from the sharp edges of the rice plants. That first night, he collapsed in the cabin he shared with 11 other men. The cabin was perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, with a dirt floor and a roof that leaked in dozens of places. There were no beds, just rough wooden platforms where people slept side by side. There was no furniture, no privacy, no comfort. An older man in the cabin, someone who had been on the plantation for decades, spoke to Samuel in a mixture of English and gestures. Samuel understood enough to know the man was offering advice. Keep your head down, do the work, don't attract attention. The overseer, Virgil Tench, was known for his use of the whip, and he had no tolerance for anyone he perceived as slow or defiant. Samuel followed that advice. He learned the rhythms of the work, the expectations, the unspoken rules. He learned to judge Tench's moods. When the overseer was irritable, when it was safest to simply disappear into the background. He learned which tasks were most demanding and which offered brief moments of rest. He learned to survive. Slowly, painfully, he also learned English. The process was frustrating. Words that seemed simple to native speakers were impenetrable mysteries to Samuel. Grammar made no sense. Pronunciation was impossible. English had sounds that didn't exist in his native language, and his attempts to reproduce them often resulted in mockery or incomprehension. But gradually, understanding came. After 6 months, he could follow simple instructions. After a year, he could hold basic conversations. After 18 months, he was functionally fluent, though he spoke with a heavy accent that would remain with him for the rest of his life. As his language skills improved, Samuel began to understand more about the plantation and the people around him. He learned that the Hartwell estate was relatively new. Duncan Hartwell had purchased the land only 12 years earlier and had built the plantation from scratch. He learned that Hartwell was ambitious, always looking for ways to expand his acreage and increase his profits. And he learned that Hartwell was known to purchase workers through unconventional channels, meaning blind landing. Samuel also learned that he and the 6 others who had arrived with him were not the first from Blind Landing to come to the Hartwell estate. There had been others before them, though not many remained. Some had died from disease or injury, others had been sold to different plantations, and a few, this was spoken of only in whispers, had disappeared in circumstances that no one wanted to discuss. An older woman named Hannah, who worked in the plantation kitchen, was one of the few people willing to talk openly with Samuel about the reality of their situation. She had been born on a different plantation and sold to Hartwell 10 years earlier. She was perhaps 50 years old, though she looked older, her face lined and her hands gnarled from decades of work. One evening, after Samuel had been on the plantation for about a year, Hannah spoke to him while they were both drawing water from the well. She kept her voice low, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "You came through the landing, didn't you?" she said. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. He had never spoken of it openly, but Hannah clearly knew. "Thought so," she said. "You got that look. The ones who come through there always do." She paused, her eyes distant. "I knew a man once. Came through there maybe 8 years ago. Good man, hard worker. But he asked too many questions. Wanted to know where he was, how he got here, whether there was a way to get word back to his family in Africa. Overseer heard him talking. Told Mr. Hartwell. One night they took him away, said they were moving him to a different plantation, but nobody ever heard of him again." Samuel felt a chill run through him. "What happened to him?" Hannah shook her head. "Don't know, but I'll tell you what I think. I think that when they bring people through that landing, they don't want anyone who might talk, anyone who might cause trouble or draw attention. And if someone becomes a problem—" She didn't finish the sentence. Samuel absorbed this information in silence. It confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. His presence on the Hartwell estate was illegal, and Duncan Hartwell had a vested interest in making sure that fact never became known. If Samuel caused trouble, if he tried to contact authorities, if he did anything that might expose Hartwell's use of blind landing, he would simply disappear. The realization was chilling, but it was also clarifying. Samuel understood now that his survival depended on invisibility. He needed to be quiet, compliant, unremarkable. He needed to blend in, to become just another worker in the fields, indistinguishable from the others. And so that's what he did. For 2 years, Samuel Oakes became invisible. The news of Fort Sumter's surrender reached the Hartwell plantation on April 15, 1861. An overseer rode in from Ashfield with a newspaper, and within hours everyone on the plantation knew the war had begun. The reaction among the white population was jubilation. Duncan Hartwell hosted a celebration at the main house, inviting neighboring planters and their families. They drank toasts to the Confederacy, to South Carolina, to their new nation and its future. In town, young men lined up to enlist in militia companies, eager to prove themselves in what they were certain would be a short, glorious conflict. Among the enslaved population, the reaction was more complex and carefully hidden. No one dared express hope openly. Hope was dangerous, and the consequences for showing it could be severe. But privately, in quiet conversations in cabins after dark, people whispered about what the war might mean. Would the Union win? Would that mean freedom? How long would the war last? Would it reach South Carolina? The questions had no answers, but simply asking them created a sense that change might be possible. Samuel listened to these conversations but said little. He had learned caution, and he knew better than to voice any opinions that might be reported back to the overseers or to Hartwell himself. But he felt something shift inside him. A tiny ember of possibility that had been dormant since the night he arrived at Blind Landing. The war brought immediate changes to the plantation. Duncan Hartwell's 2 oldest sons enlisted in a Confederate regiment and left for training. Several of the white overseers also enlisted, leaving the plantation short-handed. Hartwell hired replacements, older men or those deemed unfit for military service. But the atmosphere changed. There was a sense of disruption, of normal routines coming undone. More significantly, the war disrupted the operations at Blind Landing. Union naval blockades were being established along the southern coast, and the risk of interception for any ship attempting an illegal crossing from Africa had increased dramatically. Federal authorities, previously lax in enforcing the 1808 prohibition, were now paying closer attention to coastal activity. In late May 1861, about 6 weeks after Fort Sumter, a meeting was held at the Carolina House Tavern in Ashfield. The participants included Duncan Hartwell, several other planters who had used Blind Landing services, and a man named Cornelius Vance, who had been the primary coordinator of operations at the Cove for over a decade. The meeting was held in a private room, behind closed doors, but the tavern keeper, Mrs. Adelaide Crowe, heard enough through the walls to understand what was being discussed. Blind Landing needed to be shut down permanently. The risks were too great. But there was a problem: evidence. The physical structures at Blind Landing could be dismantled and burned. Documents could be destroyed. But there remained a more difficult form of evidence: the people who had passed through Blind Landing and now worked on plantations throughout the region. Most of them had been on their respective plantations for years by this point. They had integrated, learned English, formed relationships. They were indistinguishable from others who had been born into slavery or purchased through legal channels. They posed minimal risk, but there was a subset, those who had arrived most recently, particularly within the last 3 or 4 years, who might still be identifiable as illegal imports. These were people who still spoke limited English, who had no established connections, who might be questioned if federal authorities ever came looking. The decision made at that meeting in May 1861 was never recorded in writing. No documents exist that explicitly state what was agreed upon. But the outcome of the meeting would become clear in the weeks that followed. The evidence needed to be eliminated. The night of June 9, 1861, was warm and humid, with no moon. The darkness was absolute under the canopy of oaks that surrounded the Hartwell plantation's worker cabins. Samuel was pulled from sleep by rough hands, shaking him. He opened his eyes to see Virgil Tench standing over him with a lantern. The overseer's face was expressionless, but there was something in his eyes, a tension, a wariness, that Samuel had not seen before. "Get up," Tench said. "You're coming with me." Samuel's heart began to pound. "Where?" "Don't ask questions. Just come." 6 others from Samuel's cabin were roused as well, all of them, Samuel realized immediately, people who had arrived through blind landing within the past few years. None of the longer-term residents were selected. They were taken outside, where a wagon waited. Similar scenes were playing out at other cabins. More people were being gathered. Samuel counted at least 20 in total, possibly more. All of them shared the same characteristics. Recent arrivals, limited English, no established families on the plantation. They were loaded into wagons without explanation. Samuel tried to ask one of the other overseers what was happening, but was told to shut his mouth. The wagons began to move, leaving the plantation and heading toward the coast. The journey took perhaps 2 hours. No one spoke. The only sounds were the creaking of wagon wheels, the clopping of horses' hooves, and the night sounds of the low country. Frogs, insects, the distant call of an owl. Samuel's mind raced. Where were they being taken? Were they being sold to a different plantation? Were they being moved somewhere safer because of the war? Or was it something else? Something darker? He remembered Hannah's words from a year earlier. One night, they took him away, said they were moving him to a different plantation, but nobody ever heard of him again. The wagons stopped. Samuel was pulled out and found himself in a place he recognized, though he had not been fully conscious the first time he saw it. The shape of the live oaks, the smell of the salt marsh, the darkness of the water. This was blind landing. The tide was out. The mudflats stretched endlessly into the darkness, visible only as a slightly lighter shade of black against the surrounding night. Several lanterns provided the only illumination, casting wavering circles of yellow light. Overseer personnel from multiple plantations were present, along with a few men Samuel didn't recognize. They worked quickly and efficiently, as if following a rehearsed plan. Ropes were produced. Samuel's hands were pulled behind his back and bound tightly. Around him, the same was being done to others. Then iron shackles were fastened around their ankles. Not individual shackles, but paired ones, connecting people in twos. Samuel found himself shackled to a man he didn't know, someone from a different plantation. The man was perhaps 30 years old, thin and frightened. He kept whispering in a language Samuel didn't understand, a desperate stream of words that might have been prayers. Once everyone was secured, hands bound, ankles shackled in pairs, they were forced out onto the mudflats. The mud was slick and treacherous, sucking at their feet with every step. Samuel and the man he was shackled to stumbled together, trying to keep their balance on the unstable surface. They were pushed further out, perhaps 200 yards from the tree line, into the middle of the mudflat. There, they were left. The overseers and other men began walking back toward shore, their lanterns growing distant. Samuel called out, his voice joining others in the darkness. "Wait! Where are you going? What's happening?" Virgil Tench was the last to leave. Before he disappeared into the trees, he turned back and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "The tide comes in at midnight. I'd suggest you make peace with your God." Then the lanterns vanished into the trees, and the sound of horses and wagons faded. Silence settled over the mudflat, broken only by the sound of breathing and the quiet weeping of some of the others. Samuel understood with perfect, horrible clarity what was happening. The tide was coming in. Within hours, the mudflats would be under 6 feet of water. They were shackled, unable to run, unable to swim, unable to do anything but stand there and wait to drown. This was not a relocation. This was an execution. Panic spread through the group. Some people began pulling desperately at their bonds, trying to free themselves. Others fell to their knees, praying in languages Samuel didn't know. The man shackled to Samuel began to thrash, jerking their shared chain and nearly pulling both of them down into the mud. Samuel forced himself to remain calm. Panic would accomplish nothing. He needed to think, to assess the situation, to find any possibility of survival. He tested his bonds. The rope around his wrists was tight, tied by someone who knew what they were doing. His fingers were already going numb from lack of circulation. The shackle around his ankle was iron, fastened with a simple lock. There was no way to break it, no way to pick the lock with his hands tied. He looked around, trying to see in the darkness. The tree line was perhaps 200 yards away, close enough to see as a darker shape against the sky, but impossibly far for someone shackled and bound. Even if he could free himself, could he cross that distance through treacherous mud before the tide came in? The man beside him had stopped thrashing and was now weeping, a continuous stream of tears running down his face. Samuel wanted to say something comforting, but he had no words that would help. Time passed. Samuel didn't know how long. 20 minutes? 30? An hour? There was no way to measure it, but gradually he became aware of a change. The mud beneath his feet felt different, wetter. He looked down and saw water beginning to seep across the surface of the mudflat. The tide was coming in. The water rose slowly at first, spreading in a thin sheet across the mud, filling every depression and channel. Within 15 minutes, it was around their ankles. Within 30 minutes, it was at their calves. The panic intensified. People began screaming, calling for help that would never come. Some tried to move toward shore, but the shackles made coordinated movement impossible, and the soft mud made every step treacherous. The man shackled to Samuel lost his footing and fell forward. The shackle connecting them jerked Samuel's ankle, pulling him off balance. He fell sideways, his face splashing into the rising water. For a moment his mouth and nose were submerged. He tasted salt and mud and felt a primal terror grip him. He fought to get his head above water, his bound hands making every movement agonizing. The man beside him was thrashing, his panic making everything worse. Samuel managed to get his knees under him, then pushed himself upright. He grabbed the other man with his shoulder, trying to help him stand, and together they managed to regain their footing. The water was up to their knees now and rising steadily. That was when Samuel felt the shackle around his ankle shift. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. The iron loop had moved slightly against his skin. He twisted his ankle experimentally, and the shackle moved again, just a fraction of an inch, but movement nonetheless. Hope flared in his chest. The shackle had been fastened hastily, or perhaps the rust had weakened it. Either way, it wasn't as secure as it should have been. Samuel began working his ankle in the shackle, twisting and pulling, ignoring the pain as the iron scraped his skin. The water continued to rise, now at his thighs, but he focused entirely on the shackle. Twist, pull, twist, pull. His ankle was slick with blood now where the iron had torn the skin, but the slickness helped. The shackle moved more freely, sliding up and down his calf. Around him the sounds of panic were intensifying. The water was at waist level for most of the group now. People were crying out in languages Samuel didn't understand. He could hear prayers, curses, desperate pleas. He kept working the shackle. The man beside him, still connected by the chain, watched with desperate hope. "Can you do it?" he asked in broken English. "Can you get free?" "I don't know," Samuel said honestly. "I'm trying." The water reached his chest. Minutes, maybe only minutes, remained before it would be over his head. Samuel twisted his ankle one more time, pulling as hard as he could despite the pain. And suddenly, impossibly, his foot slipped through the shackle. He was free, or at least, his ankle was free. His hands were still bound behind his back, and he was standing in rising water with no clear path to shore. But he was no longer shackled. The man who had been connected to him grabbed at Samuel with his shoulder, trying to keep him there. "Don't leave me. Please, help me." Samuel looked at the man's desperate face. He wanted to help, but the man's shackle was secure, his lock fastened properly. There was no way Samuel could free him, not with his hands bound, not in rising water, not with time running out. He made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry," he said, and then he turned and began moving toward shore. The man's screams followed him across the mudflat. "No, please, come back. Don't leave me. Please." Samuel forced himself not to look back. He focused entirely on movement, placing one foot in front of the other, maintaining balance on the unstable mud, keeping his head above the rising water. The water was up to his shoulders now. Each step was harder than the last. The mud seemed to pull at him, trying to drag him down. His bound hands made balance nearly impossible. He fell multiple times, his face going under the water. Each time he forced himself back up through sheer will, gasping for air, and kept moving. Behind him, the screams were fading. He told himself it was because he was getting farther away, but he knew the truth. The water was over their heads now. Samuel didn't know how long he spent in the water. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 or 40 minutes. The tide continued to rise, and by the time he finally reached the tree line and stumbled onto solid ground, the water in the mudflat behind him was 6 feet deep. He collapsed on a narrow strip of sandy beach, his body shaking violently, his mind in shock. As dawn began to break, casting grey light across the marsh, he could see the cove behind him. The entire mudflat was underwater now. There was no sign of the others. No bodies, no movement, nothing. Just calm water reflecting the morning sky. 23 people had been left on that mudflat. 22 of them were dead. Samuel was the only one who survived. Samuel lay on the sandy beach for perhaps an hour, unable to move. His body was in shock. His mind had shut down, unable to process what had just happened. The sun rose slowly, turning the sky from grey to pale blue, and still he lay there. Eventually, survival instincts took over. He couldn't stay here. Someone might return. They might come looking to make sure everyone was dead. If they found him alive... He forced himself to stand. His legs barely held him. His hands were still bound behind his back, and the ropes had swollen from the water, making them even tighter. His right ankle was a bloody mess where the shackle had torn the skin, and every step sent pain shooting up his leg. But he was alive, and he needed to stay that way. Samuel began moving inland, away from the cove. He had no plan, no destination. He only knew that if he stayed near the coast, near Blind Landing, near any of the plantations where people might recognize him, he would be killed. The forest was thick with undergrowth, palmetto, sawgrass, thorny vines that tore at his skin and clothing. With his hands bound, he couldn't push the vegetation aside or protect himself from branches. He simply walked forward, forcing his way through, leaving a trail of torn fabric and blood. He walked for what felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose. The humidity was oppressive. Sweat soaked his clothing, and his mouth became parched. He needed water desperately, but with his hands bound, he had no way to drink even if he found a stream. By midday, Samuel was staggering. The blood loss from his ankle, combined with dehydration and exhaustion, was taking its toll. His vision began to blur. His thoughts became fragmented. He knew he needed to keep moving, but his body was shutting down. He stumbled into a creek, a narrow stream of clear water running through the forest. He fell to his knees at the water's edge and bent forward, pressing his face into the stream and drinking desperately. The water was cool and sweet, and for a moment it revived him. But when he tried to stand, his legs gave out. He collapsed beside the stream, unable to go any further. He slept, or perhaps passed out for an indeterminate time. When he woke, it was late afternoon. His body ached everywhere, and his ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The torn skin was red and inflamed, and he could see the early signs of infection setting in. He needed help. He needed someone to free his hands, to treat his wounds, to give him food and shelter. But who could he trust? If he approached anyone associated with the plantations, anyone who knew Duncan Hartwell or Virgil Tench, anyone who had been complicit in the operations at Blind Landing, they would turn him in or kill him themselves. Samuel forced himself to stand and kept walking. He followed the creek upstream, reasoning that water might lead him to a road or settlement. The forest around him was alive with sounds: birds, insects, the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Every noise made him flinch, convinced that someone was coming after him. As twilight fell, he heard a new sound: the rattle of a wagon on a road. He moved toward the sound and found himself at the edge of a dirt road that cut through the forest. The wagon was perhaps 50 yards away, moving toward him at a steady pace. Samuel faced a choice. He could hide, let the wagon pass, and continue alone through the forest, risking death from infection, starvation, or exposure. Or he could reveal himself and hope that whoever was driving the wagon would help, rather than harm him. The choice was made for him. His legs gave out again, and he collapsed at the edge of the road, fully visible. The wagon was close enough now that the driver would certainly see him. The wagon slowed, then stopped. Samuel heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see a white man, perhaps 50 years old, wearing simple farmer's clothing. The man stared down at Samuel with an expression that was difficult to read: surprise, certainly, but also something else. Concern, suspicion. "What happened to you?" the man asked. Samuel tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Only a croak emerged. The farmer knelt beside him, examining his bound hands and injured ankle. "Who did this?" Samuel found his voice. "Please," he whispered. "Help me." The farmer looked around, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. Then he made a decision. "Can you stand? Can you get in the wagon?" Samuel nodded. With the farmer's help, he managed to get to his feet and stumble to the wagon. The farmer helped him into the back, then covered him with a canvas tarp. "Stay quiet," the farmer said. "Don't make a sound until I tell you it's safe." The wagon began moving again. Samuel lay in the back, hidden under the tarp, and felt the rhythmic jolting of wheels on the rutted road. He had no idea where he was being taken. The farmer might be bringing him to safety, or he might be bringing him back to the authorities, to Hartwell, to Virgil Tench. Samuel was too exhausted to care anymore. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. When Samuel woke, he was lying on a narrow bed in a small room. His hands were no longer bound. Clean bandages wrapped his ankle. A blanket covered him, and a cup of water sat on a small table beside the bed. For a moment he thought he might be dreaming or dead. Then pain flooded through his body, the aching throb of his ankle, the burning of torn skin on his wrists, the deep exhaustion that made every breath feel like effort. He was definitely alive. A door opened, and the farmer who had found him entered. The man was carrying a bowl of what looked like soup or stew. "You're awake," the man said. "Good. I was worried you wouldn't make it through the night. You've been unconscious for almost 18 hours. Samuel tried to sit up, but his body protested. The farmer helped him, propping him against the wall. "My name is Josiah Pruitt," the man said. "This is my farm, about 12 miles west of Ashfield. I found you on the road yesterday evening. You want to tell me what happened?" Samuel hesitated. Could he trust this man? Pruitt had helped him, had cut his bonds and bandaged his wounds, but that didn't necessarily mean he was safe. Pruitt might still turn him in, might still contact the authorities or Hartwell, but Samuel was too weak to run, too injured to fight. And he realized that if he didn't tell someone what had happened, if he died here without speaking, then the truth of Blind Landing and the 22 people who had drowned would die with him. So he told Pruitt everything. He spoke for over an hour, his voice weak and hoarse. He described his capture in Africa, the voyage across the Atlantic, the arrival at Blind Landing. He described the 2 years on the Hartwell plantation. And he described the night of June 9th, being taken to the mudflats, the shackles, the rising tide, and the desperate struggle to escape. Pruitt listened without interrupting. His expression remained neutral, but Samuel could see emotions flickering behind his eyes: shock, horror, disbelief, and finally, something that looked like anger. When Samuel finished, Pruitt sat in silence for a long moment. "Do you believe me?" Samuel asked finally. I do, Pruitt said quietly, and I believe I need to do something about it.